So now we're moving into the afternoon session. So first off, we're going to have Sarah Donnelly, who is an Assistant Professor of Social Work and Director of Professional Practice at the School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice at UCD. Sarah is Chairperson of UCD's Ageing Network. She was the recipient of the 2024 Alone Irish Gerontological Society Willie Birmingham Medal. She has co-edited Critical Gerontology for Social Workers book, and she is an academic advisor on adult safeguarding to the Irish Association of Social Workers. And her paper today, I have managed to lose the page, will cover the issue. It's right here in front of me: caring for the carers, balancing the rights of carers and the cared for person in Ireland, implications for policy and practice. Sarah.
Hi everyone, good afternoon, and thank you so much for the lovely introduction. And again, look, I'd really like to thank Social Justice Ireland for the invitation to speak, and also to our fantastic speakers who came before me. It's been a really energising, enjoyable discussion so far. So look, for my presentation, I'm going to be talking about something a little bit different, and it's really primarily focused on the topic of what we're calling care harm. This is very much a poorly understood, but also a sensitive topic. So I suppose I want to acknowledge that from the outset. I also want to kind of acknowledge that many of you may be a carer, have been a carer, or will be a carer in the future. So I think this is an issue that is of interest to us all. And really, I suppose my presentation this morning, my intention is not to offend, but really it's to try to open up the conversation and heighten awareness about this topic that we really know very little about. I'm primarily going to be drawing on some research that I carried out with Family Carers Ireland in 2023, where we received a small bit of funding from the Irish Research Council, but I'm also going to be drawing on some ongoing work that I'm carrying out with what we're calling the Five Nations Working Group, which is a group of academics on domestic violence and safeguarding experts and care experts from across the Five Nations of the British Isles, really trying to progress our understanding around this. Okay, so look, I mean, everybody's very well versed in the context for caregiving, but again, I know the figures, some of our figures have been disputed, but we'll revisit some of this in terms of, we know Eurocares estimates that 80% of all long-term care across Europe is now provided by unpaid family caregivers. And again, Fraser would argue that since the 1980s, we've really seen the responsibility for care shift nearly entirely away from formal services and onto family caregivers themselves. And again, you know, we've talked about this morning. Some of the drivers are around our ageing population, but also increasing numbers of children and working age adults with long-term health conditions. We also know, however, that caregiving is becoming more complex and more time-consuming. And again, carers are supporting people with more complex conditions and multimorbidities such as dementia. But I suppose we have to ask ourselves, firstly, is it right or is it safe that we ask our family carers to do so much? Secondly, is it right and correct that younger people with a disability, older people, should be reliant on their family carers for care and support in our current society? I think the other important thing is, you know, certainly my research would suggest that carers are expected to continue to care under almost any circumstances. And again, we know that we have growing numbers of older carers and also younger carers, and we'll look at some Irish-specific data in a moment. This is an infographic that was done by Family or Care Alliance Ireland. And again, I think this is helpful in terms of contextualising our Irish situation. So again, estimates about 14% of our population are providing care, or just over 600,000 people. And again, we can see that's estimated at saving about 20 billion per year to the Irish economy. And I think the economic impacts, again, we've talked about this morning, but I think also important to dwell on this in terms of, for me, I think our current policy is underpinned by very much a utilitarian logic that frames family carers primarily as an unpaid economic resource. The Centre for Care in the UK has calculated the value of care in the whole of the UK at approximately 184 billion. And again, they estimate that there's been a significant increase since the 2011 data they collected, and this is primarily due to the increase in the number of care hours that family carers are providing. Again, our census data would suggest that approximately 29% of our carers here in Ireland are providing care for 43 hours or more per week. And again, many family carers are providing for one or more relatives. Petrillo et al., again from the Centre of Care, have suggested that if unpaid carers stop providing care overnight, our health and social care systems would entirely collapse. And again, I think that claim could also be made in respect of Ireland. Again, we know there are huge benefits to being a family carer. People find it very rewarding, but we also know that there can be some negative and adverse outcomes, which we have touched on this morning in terms of that poverty piece. But we also know our family carers experience significant levels of loneliness, and again, the knock-on negative impacts on both physical and mental health and well-being. 41% of our family carers also have long-term health conditions themselves. And again, it's estimated that family carers have approximately 38% higher probability of experiencing depression than the average population. So again, I suppose the indirect impact of caregiving, I think, is quite well established in terms of the care needs of someone, especially if they have more complex needs. If this is on a long-term basis, if it's very intensive caring, can be associated with a range of adverse outcomes. O'Dwyer has done some work in the English context, O'Dwyer and colleagues, where they have found that 42% of parent carers of a disabled or chronically ill child have experienced suicidal thoughts at one stage. Again, we've talked about earlier, I suppose, carers struggling to afford some of the essentials, including food, and then that social isolation piece coming back into play again. Again, we've quite a well-established research base, and it's well acknowledged, I suppose, that harmful situations can arise when carers are under extreme stress. They don't have any support from formal services. And again, in these circumstances, sometimes carers can lash out as a result of care burden or care stress. And really, I suppose this is heightened in those circumstances, but there's been very little recognition of any kind of harm or abuse of the carer themselves. So I suppose, what is direct care harm? Because again, I'm aware this mightn't be a term that many of you are familiar with. We currently don't have any accepted definition, but Dr. Louise Isham has very much done the seminal work around this in the UK, where she looked at dementia dyads, and Isham has defined care harm as when carers experience violence or become subject to controlling or coercive behaviour, either on an incidental or a systematic basis, resulting in some form of physical, psychological and/or sexual harm. Again, my own work would suggest a slightly different definition that we're still struggling with. And I think probably the major difference between my own empirical work and Isham's is around intentionality. But again, I suppose within our working understanding of this, the behaviour may be caused intentionally or unintentionally by the person with care and support needs. In some situations, there can be instances of bidirectional harm, and also some of these patterns of harmful behaviour may predate the need for care. So, for example, in domestic abuse situations, where again that caregiving role can either exacerbate or bring to light some of these harmful behaviours. Or what can happen is sometimes, I suppose, there can be certain stages in terms of an illness trajectory. So again, some of the work that I've done had shown a puberty, or for people with dementia, actually when they began to develop intimate care needs, that could often be a trigger for some of these harmful behaviours beginning to develop. So as I said, we really have very little knowledge or research around, I suppose, this impact of direct harm. And carers to date are rarely conceptualised as victims of harmful behaviour. So this is very new language, it's a very new narrative, and as I said, it is very sensitive. And part of the difficulty we have is we have very, very limited evidence about its nature and prevalence. Again, I'm only aware of the 2 studies to date that have specifically looked at this. My own interest in this area really developed from some earlier work that Family Carers Ireland did in 2019 in conjunction with the College of Psychiatrists and my colleague Dr. Deirdre O'Donnell from UCD. They surveyed 1,052 family carers in Ireland, 44% of whom reported regularly experiencing either physical aggression or verbal or emotional abuse or harm from the relative that they were caring for. Again, my own work, which again I have to say from the outset, the work that we did here in Ireland was a very small scale, very qualitative, cannot be generalised from. And when we dug in, we did some secondary data analysis of the 29 study, and really what that showed that there was two main cohorts who were reporting experiencing care harm. That was parents or carers of children or adults with autism and carers of people living with dementia. Again, I think it's really important to stress that these parents, family carers, in terms of the autism cohort, the people they were caring for didn't just have autism. They also had very complex healthcare needs, such as rare genetic conditions or mild to moderate intellectual disabilities. Likewise, with the dementia dyads, they also had other complex health and care needs, which we feel very much kind of contributed to some of these harmful behaviours. Again, for our family carers, they reported a wide range of types of harmful behaviour. This included shouting and screaming, damage and destruction of personal possessions or the family home, but also significant levels of knock-on physical violence and the psychological distress caused by that. Again, as Suzanne alluded to earlier, there was a strong gendered component to this, as there was in Isham's work. Most of the victims were women, and again, we know that most carers are females, and intimate care tends to be done more by women than men. However, we also know that some of these carers that are at risk of harm tend to be embedded in didactic, intimate relationships or in a very demanding care context. Many are isolated, and certainly many of the carers we spoke to had very little access to support services and help. So I suppose, why do we know so little about this? Why is it so taboo? Why am I talking to you about this today? I think first and foremostly, not many people don't define themselves as carers, and they never will. You know, I'm a mum, I'm a dad, I'm a sister, I'm a brother, I'm a cousin. So that terminology of family care or care does not resonate with everyone. Again, the term care harm is not easily recognisable. It isn't often accepted by professionals or carers. So again, the terminology itself is very, very problematic. And, you know, it's something that we struggled with throughout the course of the research that I did in terms of finding a terminology that really captured this phenomena and these behaviours. The other, I suppose, big consideration is for many family carers, this was very much taboo. It was sensitive. They were not comfortable opening up or speaking about this, so recruitment was incredibly difficult. Carers that we did speak to felt guilty, embarrassed, or really felt like they were being disloyal to their loved one or to their child who were exhibiting the harmful behaviour. Again, I suppose there's a private nature of family life where people aren't comfortable speaking out about this. And again, you know, those concerns about contravening either familial or cultural norms or disrupting domestic patterns within the home. For many, I suppose one of the biggest barriers and fear around disclosure, and again, I would argue these were very real and valid fears, was about either unwanted or unwelcome care or criminal interventions as a result of disclosure. And we'll look at some examples of this in a moment. So I think Isham's work, this quote from Mary, who cared for her husband with dementia, kind of sums up some of the complexity and challenge for family carers themselves in terms of speaking out. So Mary talked about, I think for me, it's about recognising that a lot of people are suffering as I did. How can you be critical of someone who is ill? It's not the illness, but it's the effect that it has on you. And I think we need a word to describe the effect on the person, on the caregiver, rather than the service user being an abuser. That's what I would like to try and find. And again, this kind of very binary, overly simplistic language of victim and perpetrator or abused and abused, abuser and abused does not fit this situation. So again, it's something I've certainly really struggled with in terms of that language. From our Irish work, I suppose what was quite powerful and quite striking was the knock-on impacts not only on the family carer but also on younger siblings and other family members. And Lana's situation speaks very strongly to this. So Lana was the carer to her son who had many complex needs. When Dee was about 9 years of age, I was home on my own, my husband was in work, and Dee came back from school and had a tremendous meltdown. He pulled my hair even though he doesn't usually do that, but that day he did. He was only 8 or 9, but he pulled me with such force that he pulled me to the ground and I hit my head and I was there for a few seconds. And then my eldest child came home from school. So imagine Dee was 9, so my eldest was 11. Can you imagine what it's like for an 11-year-old child to restrain his brother on the sofa to give me a chance to get up? I remember this to the day I die. My eldest was crying and he was saying, "Mummy, I don't know how much longer I can restrain him." Again, Lana's situation was not an isolated one, and several of the family carers we spoke to talked about the need to develop safety plans within the family home to ensure that all members of the family were safe during these kind of situations. In Lana's situation, she recognised she had a younger child who was 3, and Lana, really felt she could not ensure the safety of all the children in her family home. She reported herself to TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency, really as a cry for help, as a cry for support, and the response of the Child and Family Agency was to offer to remove the 2 children who were not exhibiting the harmful behaviour to foster care, with the expectation that Lana would continue to care for her child exhibiting the harmful behaviours with little or no support. And again, this was not an isolated narrative from the family carers we spoke to. And again, it wasn't isolated to the carers themselves. We spoke to many professionals who spoke about the hopelessness and helplessness of their inability to provide support and care, even in what was sometimes life-threatening situations. I think what's probably of equal importance is the very harmful role of the care system and of, I suppose, the whole issue of what we might call dangerous care. And again, my Scottish colleagues have done some very important work around this, where they talk about the role played by the welfare policy, but also services which can both create and aggravate the stress within care relationships, but also the responses to these. I think across the British Isles, carers very much face an opaque and complex and fragmented health and social care system where it's very unclear who they should turn to ask for help, with little or no recognition of this issue and its impact. Many of the carers we spoke to in the Irish context spoke about having to fight and beg for help in order to stay safe, and even when they did that, they were made to feel like they were undeserving, and some of the narratives were around, well, there's people worse than you out there. And again, very much the problem was put back on them to resolve and sort out. As well as that, aligned with that, there was often unrealistic and unhelpful expectations placed on carers, and these were constantly reinforced by health and social care professionals, with carers just being expected to cope in any situation. Often the solution offered was around more training or behavioural interventions rather than concrete supports like respite or educational places. And again, I suppose that there's a whole systems piece to this in terms of, for the autism cohort we spoke to, very early problems like problems with delays in diagnosis, lack of access to educational places, really had a knock-on impact in terms of the family's ability to cope. And again, what we really saw was those who had more social capital, who had access to finance, to education, who could pay for private assessments, were able to get help and support a little bit earlier. Again, what we saw is for many of our family carers, the supports and services they had pre-COVID were never reinstated to the full extent after the pandemic, so they continued to struggle to cope. And again, I think there may be a case for arguing that system-related harm is a type of social harm. In terms of the unrealistic expectations, and again, we've talked about the carers allowance earlier, but I think, again, this captures the whole dilemma very well. So one of our Family Carers Ireland senior managers talked about this perception that you're getting carers allowance, so you've signed your life away. And exactly what does it mean to be a family carer? And, I think of parents of children with additional needs who are really good at vocalising this. My child needs 24/7 care. It's amplifying those voices and kind of saying, nobody can provide care 24/7. And it's not that you're paid to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, So again, these unrealistic expectations from care providers, from services, from disability managers was incredibly unhelpful and in fact exacerbated the harm in many situations. But we also had situations of unhelpful responses. And again, Mairead's situation speaks to this very well. Mairead was the carer to her dad who had a moderate dementia and required 2 for all activities of daily living and transfers. So Mairead talked about there was an incident where a carer was hurt. This was the paid home care, professional carers. So there was just 2 carers in the room at the time. So, obviously we weren't there to see what happened. A carer got injured, and the next day at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I got a phone call from the manager of Older Person Services advising me that all care had been withdrawn with immediate effect from my dad. She advised that there had been a physical assault within the home, that my dad needed a psychiatric assessment, and that it wasn't safe for her employees to be coming into the home, and that we could also expect a call from the Gardaí. And again, in this situation, that harmful, that behaviour, which was very much an expression of unmet need, was then criminalised. For Mairead, the situation, she was left to provide full-time care to her dad along with her 80-year-old mother. So again, these unhelpful responses really, I suppose, adding to the hurt and injury in these very difficult caregiving relationships. So as you can see, there are a number of kind of significant terminological but also conceptual issues. And I suppose care harm very much challenges a number of our dominant narratives that currently underpin our policy and practice relating to carers and their relatives. As I said, some of this constraining binary discourse about who can legitimately be regarded as a victim or perpetrator of abuse or harm is problematic. And for example, the Care Act 2014 in England only identifies the person with care and support needs as possibly being at risk within caregiving relationships. The family carer themselves is never constructed as possibly being at risk of harm. And I think what's probably quite challenging about this is it does unsettle our persistent framing of family caring as virtuous and natural, and care relationships as always positive. I think that the big issue around here, as I said earlier, is around the organising focus of intentionality, and it really obscures some of that complexity of caring and can act to a barrier in terms of help seeking. And you know what our study really firmly showed was that most carers are incredibly reluctant to describe the person with care and support needs as abusive, especially if this behaviour is unintentional, for example, arising from a condition such as dementia. In terms of our Five Nations Working Group, this is our little collective that we've been working on, and what we've been trying to do is analyse the care strategies, adult safeguarding legislation, domestic violence legislation, and really looking at that intersection of care and harm across the 5 nations of the British Isles. And I suppose some of our early findings have concluded that England, Ireland and Northern Ireland have very much a focus on the discourse of duty and familial responsibility. Wales and Scotland have moved somewhat more to kind of a rights-based recognition orientation framing. In everything we've analysed so far, unpaid care remains largely established as a family responsibility, with the most demanding, unequal and emotionally complex aspects largely unacknowledged. Care relationships are presented implicitly as almost entirely positive, with carers portrayed as virtuous and heroic. And this implicit assumption that everybody is able and willing and capable of caring is very much inbuilt to everything we've looked at. Whilst interdependency and those direct harms are really not explicitly recognised. So we really need to look at our policy and legislative framework around this going forward. So what might help in terms of policy? Some of our recommendations are around the need for intersecting enforceable legal rights, which would help to ensure that carers and the cared for person or child are better protected and supported. So that statutory entitlement to services for both the carer and the person with care and support needs is paramount. That does exist in the Care Act in England. We don't have anything like that currently in Ireland. But there should also be a legal right for carers to be protected from harm. Paid carers are protected under employment legislation. Our family carers currently are not. And as I said, there's no meaningful limit on the demands placed on carers, including what they're expected to tolerate in terms of harmful behaviours. For me, I think we need to consider carer harm as of equal importance to other types of harm, such as domestic abuse. So this is a social justice as well as a welfare issue. And for our working group as well, we feel like family care is currently a privatised risk where families bear all of the costs and responsibilities for care. But again, we feel there's a need to shift and look at this as more of a social risk. In terms of the study and the work that I did with Family Carers Ireland, we were very committed from the outset to not just look and understand more about this issue, but also to try and develop resources or supports that might better help support family carers, but also to raise awareness. So we ran a number of co-design word cafes where we developed awareness-raising leaflets. I have one, our dementia one. We developed one generically around what is care harm, one specific to caring for a person with dementia, and one specific to caring for a child or adult with autism and additional needs, and also best practice considerations. So again, there's a Creative Commons licence on that, and we've seen many local authorities in England and other organisations kind of take these up and adapt them for their own use. And again, we hope this will help people to open up and speak out about these situations. I suppose in terms of going forward, we really need to accord family carers and the cared for person or child equal right to be protected from harm. And for me, this is really about the balancing of rights and ensuring that all family members are safe, protected and supported. However, given our projections around the need for increased care, we do anticipate that the abuse of unpaid family carers could flourish, where the demand for care is great, but also where there are complexities in relation to the needs for the cared for person, but also a lack of concrete formal supports. So as I said, in the Irish context, the lack of that legislative underpinning and the statutory right to home care, the right to a legislative fulfilment of disability assessments, and a family carer's right to a standardised assessment of need is critical. My understanding is our the Interrace single assessment tool, which Ireland has been piloting for the last 10 years. I'm not sure when we're ever going to see that rolled out, but inbuilt in that is an assessment of need for the cared for person and the family caregiver. And I think that's really what we need to advocate for going forward. But I think we also need to, as it was mentioned earlier, this whole concept of interdependence and really considering that and embracing that and the interdependent nature of everyday living. And really recognising at every stage, at some stage in our lives, every one of us will require or need care. So we have tried to write some of this up in terms of disseminating and raising awareness. This article is based on the Irish study in the British Journal of Social Work, and again the kind of broader policy piece that's been published in the Journal of Adult Protection. Again, I have some references there for anyone who wants to read up on the remainder of that, and other than that, I'm happy to answer any questions.